Hello, Dr. Dike Drummond here at the home of thehappymd.com in beautiful Seattle, Washington. Welcome to the latest episode of the Physicians on Purpose podcast. Tools so you can recognize and prevent your own burnout. Stories of burnout put to its highest and best use, and wellness leadership strategies. Everything you need to be a physician on purpose. Hello again, this is Dr. Dike Drummond at the home of thehappymd.com in beautiful Seattle, Washington with the next edition of the Physicians on Purpose podcast. And just before we start, I've got a super special guest for you who you're really going to enjoy. But real quick, take a big deep breath with me. Let's pop out of the whirlwind. Big deep breath in. And as you exhale, just let go of anything that doesn't need to be here right now. And come out of the whirlwind with me. Step out. Let's talk a little bit about what it's like to be a doctor. Today's guest on the podcast is Dr. Gita Pensa, MD. She's an emergency room physician, an associate professor at Brown, and perhaps even more importantly to our purposes, she is the developer, producer, originator, author of a gorgeous podcast called Doctors and Litigation. The L word, Doctors and Litigation, the L word. You've got to check it out. It's a labor of love for her. She tells her story about the most egregious lawsuit I've ever heard, which she's going to tell us about on this podcast. But she also has done this as a labor of love. That is this American Life quality audio production. It's really beautiful. It's self-encapsulated into a course. Helps a lot of different doctors tell their litigation stories and talks about all sorts of aspects to being sued. What it's like to work with malpractice companies, what it's like to listen to people lie on the stand and all that kind of stuff. So Dr. Pensa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for that probably overly kind introduction, but It's very nice to be here. Thank you.
We will let our listeners judge, okay? So we met a few weeks ago and had a chance to talk, and what I'd like to do, since you're going to be on several podcasts here, we're going to be talking, and this is going to be the only time we get a helping of you. And so what I'd like to do is just start at the beginning of your journey through the legal issues, right? And again, I always have an international audience. These are issues that are most likely quite specific to the United States of America, because things that happen in Canada and England and Australia and other places like that, and I've just stuck with the English-speaking world, they're very different because they don't have anywhere near as many lawyers as we do, and they have a national risk management program. And I've worked with those people before. So it's American specific, but would you please, and we'll do this in abbreviated manner because it lasts what, 12 years?
12 years.
It's a 12-year story we're going to tell in the next few minutes. So if you could please like wind us back in time into the beginning of this story, and I'll just pop questions now and then.
Sure. So let me take you back to 2006. I was a young attending. I'd been about 5 years out from residency at that time, and I was working in a community emergency department as a nocturnist. I worked nights. So I was usually the only doctor in the hospital. Run upstairs for codes. I would run upstairs to deliver a baby because OB wasn't house. I would come back to the emergency department. It was very stressful, but it was also what I felt like I was trained to do. I found it very exciting, and I was really enjoying it. And then one night I took care of a young woman. She was 31, and she, suffice to say, came in with a very confusing presentation. I spent a lot of time with her. I spent a lot of time with her husband, trying to sort out what was going on. I called a consultant. I imaged her. My chart reflects that I saw this person probably 5 or 6 times during her emergency department stay, assessing, reassessing. Had a very, very close follow-up time for follow-up. She was going to see that specialist that morning, 3 hours after I wound up discharging her from the emergency department. But she never made it there. She went home, and an hour later, she had a terrible cerebellar stroke. And then she was taken to a tertiary care center. So I didn't even know anything had happened until I was named in a lawsuit a few months later. And I was completely floored.
What was it that eventually happened to her? What was the diagnosis?
Eventually the diagnosis was a vertebral artery dissection. And what had happened was she had had cervical surgery, not immediately before that, but maybe a couple of weeks she was home recovering. And when she came in, her presentation was that of eye pain.
Wow.
Yeah. And she actually, it was very interesting because it was tied over with this history of migraines, and it was very confusing. But the neck was no complaints about pain in the neck or anything like that, and absolutely no other neurologic findings.
Wow.
And then her pain resolved. And so it was a vertebral artery dissection too. So even if you worked backwards thinking like, oh, maybe she had referred pain from a carotid, it wasn't a carotid. It didn't make any sense. In hindsight, there was no way to connect the dots. As I said, experts have looked at this case from every which angle, and there's no way to make it make sense, which I now accept. But at the time, I found incredibly frustrating. And that's a whole podcast unto itself, for this emotional journey from blaming myself and feeling, being made to feel that I was at fault for this event, to then coming to terms with what happened being something that I had absolutely no way to predict and absolutely no way to intercept. It just wasn't anything that was in my power.
Right.
But nevertheless, at the beginning of this whole 12-year journey, I didn't know any of those things. I didn't understand what was happening. And I certainly didn't understand what was happening in a medical legal sense, because nobody had ever talked to me about what to do once the finger was pointed at you. We had risk management lectures, all sorts of, how to chart properly, documenting how to stay out of trouble. But literally not one word about what to happen once you were named. And the implication of that, in retrospect, I think, is that if you're a good doctor, you don't need to know that. So when you are served with papers,
it means you did something wrong.
It means you did something wrong.
And especially in the United States, I just want to call to our international audience, especially in the United States, you don't have to do anything wrong in order to get sued. Lawyers are going to look at the state of the patient, which is a tragedy, right? It's an absolute tragedy, but they're going to look at the state of the patient and the state of the potential settlement and choose based on the potential upside of winning a case.
And this was a very tempting case because it was a young defendant. It's all about the optics. So it was a young defendant who had damages, who lived, who had both economic and personal damages. And so not to fast forward in our story, but their original demand was around the $28 million mark. And I was the sole defendant. So here I am, this young attending who had no idea about thing one, about the litigation system, finding myself as the sole defendant, the sole physician defendant. My group was also named, but my sole physician defendant in a $28 million case. And I had seen this before. I had seen, front page news of multi-million-dollar verdicts against physicians in our state, call them out by name, publicly shaming them. You never hear the doctor side of the story. And I just, right. I didn't think I could handle it.
Well, how old were you at the time and how far out of your residency?
I was 5 years out of residency. So what would that have made me? I was about 35-ish.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Got it. And I just want everybody to know, I'm sitting here, we're recording this on both video and audio, and I'm looking at Dr. Pensa and she's fine. Okay. Yes. She's smiling. She looks great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a long journey to great though.
Right.
It was a long journey to okay.
Right.
And that's basically what I talk about in the podcast. But the long and the short of it is, I eventually went to trial in 2011. And that trial lasted 4 weeks, and I won, but I will say fairly that I was a bit of a disaster. I was a terrible defendant. I required all sorts of hand-holding because no one really had ever talked to me about how to emotionally handle this at all.
Right.
And I was just sort of an emotional mess, and I just wanted the whole thing to go away. I was very defensive. Once I sort of had all the experts, both adversarial experts and my own experts reading their opinions, I just became very defensive. I felt like this shouldn't be happening. I lost all sorts of faith in my choice of career. I didn't want to be a doctor anymore, but I had to show up because I had big loans. I didn't want to see patients anymore. I was afraid. I just was convinced that, every single one of them was just another opportunity to either actually hurt someone, make a mistake, that was always looming too, or to be sued if there was a bad outcome. I was in a very, very bad place. And that had all sorts of ripple effects with my own personal health, lots of physical symptoms, definitely took a toll on my marriage. And my children had, I was completely impatient with them. When you don't, when you're under a very large amount of psychological stress about which you don't talk to anyone, and which generates in you a great deal of shame and sort of an existential crisis about your life's work and what you've dedicated yourself to. It comes out in very unhealthy ways. And I will readily admit it came out in a lot of unhealthy ways. And so even though I did win at trial in 2011, I didn't want to go back to work. It was a we call it a Pyrrhic victory, I guess is the word for it. It was physicians never win for real in litigation. You either lose or you lose less. And so I lost less, but I just was still so lost. And then sometime after that, I got notice of the plaintiff's intent to appeal, which I hadn't even really thought of as a possibility. And it moved through every level of the courts in Rhode Island. And in 2015, that verdict was overturned. And I found myself heading back to trial. And I just did not think I could do it. I did not think I could do it. And I did not want to do it. I begged my insurer to settle. I was at a real low point. And it was about then that I realized that I was in a bit of trouble finally, after the better part of a decade being, swallowed quite whole by this. And I came to this moment of really needing to either succumb or learn to swim. And, I actually remember it as this moment when I hung up with a phone call with my attorney, particularly emotional phone call. And I hung up the phone and I can picture it still. I just, these great heaving sobs at my kitchen table. And I'd become so acquainted with that, and then I just had this, I call it my Scarlett O'Hara moment, where I decided, like, you know what, you're going to make me go to trial with God as my witness. I am not going to be like this again. I'm not doing this anymore. I cannot be like this anymore. And that was the day that I finally thought, like, maybe somebody out there knows how to do this better than I am doing this. Maybe there's somebody out there that can help me. And that was the day that I started learning. There was a few books written about physicians in litigation. I got those, I read them. I got self-help books, and I'd never bought one in my life. And it turns out that some of them are pretty good. If you take the advice, it's not that hokey, actually. Like, if you actually, do work, sometimes these things actually help. And so it was one thing after another, these tiny little baby steps of learning how I might find a path to being okay. And the more I learned, the better I felt, and the more changes I started making in my own life, choices that benefited me and my family and our happiness. I did speak. I didn't start. I have had therapy. I did not officially start therapy then, but I did speak to friends who are therapists about this whole process, and it was completely illuminating because I had not been a therapy person before that, and now like there's no zealot like a convert, man. I will tell the cows come. So I have definitely learned the value of therapy, these so-called self-help books, thinking and working on how to improve, yes, on you. And this is not, it really was a sea change for me. And I think that a lot of physicians, especially physicians of, I want to say my generation or older, who were taught that to think about medicine differently and our role in medicine as completely self-sacrificial, it felt a little bit like sacrilege to be doing that.
Well, and let me just ask, because one of the things that I notice, and one of the things that I teach in my coaching and my training, is that we as physicians are conditioned, brainwashed, programmed to work with two prime directives. One is acknowledged by everybody: the patient comes first. So when we do something to the patient and it doesn't work out, especially if we miss a diagnosis, even worse, if you were to do a medical error, actually commit something that harmed a patient, we're destroyed by that. But the second one is never show weakness. Never do anything that would imply that I'm not superwoman, I'm not, completely impenetrable, right? That there's nothing wrong with me, damn it. So to what extent, and what happens is you have to also survive a medical education system and a healthcare delivery system that is riddled with bias and discrimination. Mm-hmm. I stand here as a big old white guy. I haven't had any of that shit. I can get away with stuff that you could never get away with. Because if you're listening on the podcast, Dr. Pensa is a petite, attractive Indian female. Fortunately, English is her second language, and she's probably an American citizen, yes?
I'm an American citizen. I was actually born here, so yeah.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff, right?
Correct.
But
Correct.
to what extent do you think the and she's an ER doc, not a pediatrician, right? So I would think that there's a little bit of programming here that would having you deny, I ain't gonna read any of those damn self-help books. I'm a doctor, for heaven's sake, right? This bulletproof, never show weakness, doggone it, I'm a rock, I'm an island, that took a decade to wear down. Do you think that had anything to do with this?
Oh, 1,000%. 1,000%. I think that I had, like, perhaps many children of immigrants who had something to prove and sort of relished the proving of things, I think, as
right.
I went along. I definitely sort of fit the mold of overachiever, bit of a perfectionist when it came to medical practice, wanting to be the smartest kid in the room, and just, very carefully crafting a persona of this, maybe I'm this petite brown little woman, but I am,
don't mess with me.
Yeah, don't mess with me, right? And I'm good at my job. I'm good at what I do. And it took a lot of, sort of carefully constructed persona building to get there.
Well, it reflected the truth, though, right? Because of those physical characteristics of you as a person going through this system, you had to be twice as good to get half the credit.
Well, yeah, I'd like to acknowledge that. I think I am good at what I do, and I think that I did. It was an achievement for me, but I also think that there is something to be said for the weight of having people second guess you all the time. And nothing brings out imposter syndrome like litigation.
Right.
Because the first thought that you have is, I am not as good at this as I thought I was. and everybody else is going to know it now. And that is really, especially coming back to the point that you've dedicated your life, you've built your whole identity around the building of this bulletproof physician. And when that all comes crumbling down, it's tough. It's tough. And I did not know what to do with that. I hadn't the faintest idea what to do with that. And we don't talk about it. And we're also told not to talk about anything. Once you're sued, that's it. It's supposed to be, lights out. So you just, live with it or not. But that is where I was. So it's very, again, we can talk about this for hours. It is so complex, what happens to the psyche of a physician when they are sued, especially in a case that has a very significant adverse outcome.
And a 12-year tail.
And a 12-year tail. I didn't finish the tail.
Hang on a second. One more quick thing while we're here. You said you actually, and again, this is a relatively rare thing for physicians, and it's not because we are stoic. People say physicians are so stoic. No, we're programmed not to ask for help because that could be interpreted as a sign of weakness, especially if you happen to be a surgeon, especially if you happen to not be a big old white guy like me in any way. Right? I'm a large, old, white, straight, American-born, native English-speaking, cis man.
Well, I would argue that it's very hard for white men to ask for help too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
The reasons behind that may be different. But what I have found to be a fairly universal thing among physicians is that whatever our paths to becoming a physician, and those are varied and complex, whatever those are, it's fairly universal that asking for help is really difficult.
Yes. It's the never show weakness, because again, if you were to ever ask for help from an attending or from a colleague in your residency program, that would pierce the persona of being self-contained and having your shit all together. And I find that is even more of a persona, even more of challenging if you don't happen to be a big old white guy like me. Now, fortunately for you, I don't sense that there was any gender or other bias present in the lawyer's decision to sue you. It was simply a numbers game, I would think. But
I don't know. I think about that sometimes, but when we can talk about this again some other time, I think that most plaintiff's attorneys use the deposition as a way to size you up. And so, because they won't have seen, nowadays they will have Googled you and seen your picture and all sorts of other stuff. But, in 2006, they probably would have found some stuff and thought like, oh, okay, maybe, would it be far better for them if I did have an accent? Probably. Would it have been better for them if I wore a hijab? Probably.
Right.
But so they'll sort of size you up at deposition and decide, like, is this a person that winner chicken dinner, but at trial the jury may have their biases against, so they'll work all those. But I don't think I gave them much in that department. But I was sort of an emotional mess.
Right.
So that, I did try. My deposition performance was okay. I had this junior attorney assigned to me to teach me how to give a deposition because I was awful. And it turned into this like My Fair Lady scenario where he was just teaching me how to behave. And so I think I did a fair enough job at that. But yes, Yes, all of those things were to be considered. When plaintiffs decide, are they pushing for a settlement? Are they trying to bring you to trial? All sorts of things that have nothing to do with your quality of care come into play.
Okay, so you won, they appealed, it took 4 more years, it was overturned. Your company decided to go back to trial again. Let's put a bow on this. And again, you're sitting here in front of me as an innocent person. So please put a bow on it.
Well, what happened was I mentioned that somewhere around that time of the overturning of the verdict, I started to learn how to save myself, basically. And so the person that wound up going back to trial a second time in 2018 was a very different person than had gone to trial in 2011. And I had the benefit of understanding the system, of having talked to lots of people about what was happening, about learning how to handle it. I had used knowledge as a tool to mitigate my anxiety. I had managed my emotions around it. I was now a very good defendant. And I had also worked on finding ways to enjoy what I did in medicine again. And I really started, as many people do when they find their way back, with very small things, just looking for, for me, it wasn't in the trauma bay. It was in these everyday interactions with patients where you felt like you made a little bit of a difference and made somebody just feel a little bit better and alleviated a little bit of suffering. And there was an essay, and people ask me all the time who wrote it. I don't know anymore, but it was one of these trade newspapers, and it was an essay just about the spiritual satisfaction of caring for society's forgotten in the emergency department. We are the people who care for the only people who do sometimes. The chronically homeless, the alcoholics, the schizophrenics, and you may be the one person who was kind to them in a given day. And I cut that out, and I carried it around with me for a long time as just this reminder that what I do matters. And that brought a little spark back. And then I made bigger changes. I joined the academic faculty at Brown in 2015, somewhere around the same time. And I started learning new skills, podcasting, blogging, that kind of thing. I became sort of an educational technology person. And with that, I started having ideas, because I was already thinking then, even before the second trial, I was already thinking that now in my new role as an educator with some new skills and with this real desire to make something meaningful happen out of all of this mess, not even knowing what the outcome of the second trial would be, but that was when I started laying the groundwork for the podcast. And I actually started doing interviews with other physicians. I went on social media to find physicians who were willing to talk anonymously about their experiences in litigation and what it did to them as physicians and as human beings, not about their cases, but about what it did to them.
Right.
And how they coped, which was not something anyone was talking about. And so I started gathering these. I knew I couldn't release anything until after the trial, so I started gathering these interviews with this plan in place of what I was going to be doing. And then 6 months before the second trial, I was doing pretty well, but I wanted to put a pin on all the interviewing, because being immersed 24/7 in that world while having a trial coming up was probably not the right headspace to be in. But I knew I needed something to help me get through those last few months. And so I was looking for something. I figured I knew it when I saw it, but I was open to something to keep my mind occupied with something that wasn't about medical malpractice. And it came in the form of an email from a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, who had participated in this thing last year. I got an email about a charity in Rhode Island called Dancing with the Doctors. And I was going to delete it again. And then I saw, and I've seen this in the past. This was like the 8th year this was happening. And it's a program where they match physicians with professional ballroom dancers. And you train in a Dancing with the Stars type way for a big gala with like 1,000 people. And the main objective is fundraising for a medically related charity. And so that year it was the Rhode Island Free Clinic. And so the physicians compete not only in dancing, but also in fundraising. And it's just, it's a wonderful, wonderful program. But I before had been like, that's great, but no way. Like I have no time, and yeah, it's great, but that's not me. And then I was going to delete it again. And then I saw the date of the gala was a week before originally it was actually 3 days before, and then my trial got moved, but it wound up being a week before, my second trial was set to start. And I thought that, maybe this was the thing. And so, I filled out the form and I sent it in, and I had a little bit of a like, oh my God, what did I just do? And then I was, I was in it to win it. I was single-mindedly focused on winning this thing. And if not winning it, but then raising enough money to clinch some kind of fundraising award. And so I trained with this, he was like the 3-time ballroom dancing champion of the Czech Republic. I mean, when I say,
oh, wow,
this guy could dance like nothing I've ever seen in my life. It was unbelievable. And so I trained with this person for 4 months, and shook down everyone I knew for money, going back to like high school. And I mean, I really worked it. I'm not, I don't run marathons. I don't I'm not one of those people asking for like, $5 for my, whatever walk I'm doing. Like I don't usually do that, but I was like, right. I'm going through it, every single contact I have. And I was 1,000 times more nervous about this ballroom dancing competition than I was about going to trial.
Good.
But no, in a great way. And I was very open and honest about why I was doing it. So my whole emergency department, the staff, like they were so into it. They were so into it. And I would post my progress on social media, and I'd see the videos, and they, wound up, 1/3 of our staff came. They made signs. They rented this limo that had like a bar and a pole, and it was like a 40-minute ride to where the gala was. And so they were ready to have fun. They were like red carpet ready, totally fun. And it was honestly like one of the greatest nights of my life. It was just so fun. I danced 3rd, and then it was over with, and I just partied, with everybody else. My family was there. I felt like I did a good job. And I won. I raised single-handedly, well, not single-handedly, with all of the help of everyone I ever knew in my life. But I raised $25,000 for the clinic. And the total take that night was like $130,000 for the free clinic. And it was magnificent. It was really, and something I would never have done. If it weren't, and I'm not saying that it was a nice thing to get sued so that I could do that. But when I look at it, I am legit proud of myself. I am like proud of myself that I did that.
Yep.
And so, it's changed the way I think about myself and what I can do and what I can recover from. And, as my lawyer called it, he called it a very fine lemonade.
There you go. Absolutely. And so by the time you had won the fundraising prize and you had completed your dancing contest, what was it like then to go from that triumph into the trial?
I was, as I said, a very different person for the second trial. And I had practiced and prepared for that role as well. I went in, you never know the outcome when you go to trial. It's completely unpredictable, but I went in thinking I was as well prepared as I could possibly have been for that role. I actually, the same emergency department staff who had come to the gala came to trial. They would sit in the benches and be very supportive during the breaks and tell me that, this is BS. You're better than that.
We've got your back, right?
We got your back. This is all baloney, which was incredibly meaningful. And because one thing that you really, among the many things that we suffer with during this is the fear of the loss of respect of our colleagues. And so to have people tell you, like, we think you're a great doctor, you just got to come back to work. Like, just, this is all whatever it is, just like wrap this stuff up and then come back. Incredibly meaningful. And I also, I testified really well. I invited my residents to come to watch.
Wow.
To learn, because I felt like they needed to know, they should see this. And honestly, only a handful took me up on it. I asked a couple, like, why didn't you come? And they were like, it would frighten me.
They're scared to death.
They were scared to come. They were scared to come, which I think says a lot, but that's a whole other conversation. But of the few who did, actually, I think they got a lot out of it. But even on the home front, I wanted to be, so my children now had grown up they were teenagers now, and they had grown up for, 12 years with this, this dysfunctional family member. And they, I know, were looking at me to know, how I handled it. And I wanted to be this model of grace under pressure for them. And, it may not have been perfect, but I did okay, and I think that a lot of my learning how to handle myself and take care of myself, I have 3 daughters, and I was pregnant with one of them at the time I saw this patient. By the time it wrapped up, she was in middle school.
Wow.
And the other 2 were older. And so, this is not an isolated event, right? There's so much carryover to every other facet of our lives, and how we react to it and take care of ourselves in these moments is not only for ourselves, it's for, if you have children, you are modeling a behavior that is incredibly important for them to absorb, I think. And so in the end, it was a 2.5, it was a much shorter trial this time. And the demands were lower, and I did win a second time, and then they declined to appeal. And so for the first time in all of those 12 years, I was finally done.
Yay.
Yay. Yay. Very different person. Definitely a stronger and more resilient person for it. I would not go through it again, but I can say that I feel like I took something positive out of it. Yes, right.
Fingers crossed. Knock on wood.
But I also accept that it might, I'm like, knock wood.
Right.
I'm kind of due. It's my only, I've been practicing for 20 something years, and that was the one. So, it happens to most of us, every 7 or 8 years. And so I shouldn't be surprised. I probably will, I won't be happy about it. I will be a very different person when I receive notice the next time, because there probably will be a next time.
So I have 3 quick questions. Perhaps they're quick to put a bow on this particular conversations, because we're going to have several more. First of all, you said you found some self-help books, and some of them weren't too bad. What's your favorite self-help book?
So as it pertains to litigation in particular, my favorite probably was, and there's some layers behind it, but there's a book called When Good Doctors Get Sued. And it was meaningful to me for a few reasons. One, another physician gave it to me. He knew what was happening, but didn't really know how to talk to me about it, but clearly could tell that I was suffering.
Right.
And so one day, and I didn't know him very well. One day, just after a shift, he's like, I've had this with me at work for a while, and I've been meaning to give it to you. Just maybe read this. And so that was one of the first books that so I'd had it for a little while. It lived in the drawer of my bedside table, but I didn't read it.
Right.
I didn't read it, but the title of it was really important to me.
Right.
When Good Doctors Get Sued. And so it was the first time I'd had this, well, someone wrote a book about good doctors getting sued.
Right.
So it probably happens that you could be a good doctor and get sued. And so it was so funny. It had to be a year that it was in that drawer.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't take it out. I knew it was there. I would see the title when I'd open the drawer for anything else, and then I'd shut it. I have no idea what, I could unpack that with a therapist. Like, why couldn't you read the book? But eventually I did. I took it out, and it was the first book. It was the first book that I read. And it just, it opened the door to finding other books, to accepting that I could read something like this and I would feel understood, and that there were things that I could take out of it that were perhaps more universal than I thought, and that I wasn't some sort of freak for feeling the way I felt. And, because a lot of it too was this feeling of like, why can't I just get over this? What is wrong with me?
Right.
Like, I just get over all sorts of stuff all the time. Like, we carry all sorts of emotional burdens as physicians. And what we do is we deal with it, right? That's what we do. And I certainly had plenty of emotionally catastrophic events at work that I had contended with and felt like I processed okay. Why could I not get over this? And so the self-flagellation about it finally stopped, where I started to realize, like, this is not like other stressors. This is different.
Yeah, the terrible outcomes at work are about somebody else's terrible outcome. This is about you. And the other thing that I noticed was you said after the dancing contest that the trial started and you felt like you had prepared for that. And then you used the R word, prepared for that role. And from my perspective, I'm sitting here in the catbird seat watching this all go down. I'm noticing you were destroyed by the first round of testimony. You were fused with it. It was you. It wasn't a role. It was you going through the first trial, and you had done the work to separate yourself into your observer self and the one that was standing in the dock, right? So you saw this as a role. That healthy separation was a big piece of it. And then my last question for this particular conversation is, okay, 12 years later, you've been through the catharsis. You've put this episode of stress, burnout, imposter syndrome to its highest and best use to wind you back into a more purposeful existence, right? To point you on a path with more purpose. After all of this time, to win the case and they don't appeal, how was it to be in the wake of the apparent conclusion of this chapter in your life?
The answer to that is a little complex because you would think that the only answer would be relief.
No, I don't think that. That's why I'm asking.
There was relief.
Because you've already said, hey, if it wasn't for this case, I wouldn't have done the dancing with the doctors thing and had the triumph of that experience.
Yeah, so it was pretty complex. I mean, obviously I was very happy to have won, and I was very happy to finally be able to stop worrying about the litigation itself, but it had wrought what it had wrought. And so I did take a little time, I think. I gave myself the luxury of some self-reflection, introspection, to figure out, okay, like, what will I do now? Because this has been now like such a huge part of my life, taking up a lot of real estate,
right,
in my life. And now that is over, do I just shut the door and say, like, let's just pretend that never happened, which is super tempting.
And impossible.
And also impossible, yes. Very tempting, though. There are some people who probably would do a pretty good job of just pretending. I know some physicians who would. I mean, it comes out as it comes out, but I know some physicians who the things that they just put a lid on and squeeze tight. It's pretty impressive. But I didn't think that was going to make me feel whole in any way. And so that was when I decided, okay, now it's time to get to work on this podcast.
Nice.
And I'm just gonna keep everything really fresh in my memory. I actually had kept some audio diaries through it. I just, voice memos while waiting for certain things. And so I actually have this record of how I was feeling, what I was thinking, knowing that I might use some of those for the podcast. And I don't use many of them, but I did, as the time went on, I would listen to them and think about what it felt like to be in that role. Cause it's easy to forget, I think, as time blunts things. But I decided it was time to get working on the podcast, and that even if nobody ever listened to it, it was going to be something for me. I was going to work on my audio editing and make it a creative project. And, I set out to make the thing that I wish I'd had when I started.
There you go. Yes, exactly. Right. So, and again, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about your podcast. Doctors and Litigation, the L word, it's magnificent. It's a self-contained diary and a community of people taking you through everything you should learn about litigation, but they didn't teach you in medical school and residency. It's magnificently edited. You can get it wherever you subscribe to podcasts. Obviously, a labor of love. Obviously, an audio journal of your journey and connection to other folks that have been through similar journeys. It's just magnificent. So if you're listening now, go subscribe now. Make sure that I saw one of the reviews said, I devoured this whole podcast. And how many episodes are there?
There's 11. There will be 12 in the end.
I devoured
one last one that I've been sitting on during COVID. I just didn't. It's the last one's going to be called Life After Litigation. And I have all of the things that I want to put into it sort of teed up, but I just haven't done it yet. And so I was waiting for me to have the bandwidth emotionally to deal with it, and for listeners to have the bandwidth to deal with it emotionally. And we're probably getting there. So hopefully that'll be out in the next couple of months.
Well, it would potentially be something you could interpret as an external sign of closure. And it certainly is bittersweet to go on a journey of this magnificence and this impact and think that there's an end. Think that, okay, like you said, what do I do now?
What do I do now?
Well, what you do is you live, right? You keep living, and this is a piece of your life. Just magnificent. Thank you so much for sharing your story. We are going to have you back, absolutely. And one of the things I want to talk about in a future episode is litigation concerns, specifically in the era of COVID and its aftermath, because I think you and I saw one of your podcasts, and I have spoken about this back in March of 2020, that one of the waves of impact in COVID is going to be an enormous wave of post-COVID litigation from a number of different directions. Sad but true here in the United States of America. So, Dr. Pensa, is there anything else in this episode you'd like to share with our listeners?
I would just like to remind everybody that you and your life and your practice are more than any one case. By one overarching lesson, I would let it be that.
You have a body of work. This is one example. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you view this journey in your life, you didn't do anything wrong. But even in not doing anything wrong, you learned some great lessons. And you're a great example, mentor, teacher for all of us. So thank you so much for your time and your energy here today. Dr. Gita Pensa, MD. Let's give you the correct title, right? You are Associate Professor at Brown, podcaster extraordinaire. Again, the podcast is Doctors and Litigation, the L word. Go subscribe to it, and we'll see you again down the road for another podcast episode. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right on. Dike Drummond at thehappymd.com in Seattle, Washington. That's the latest edition of the Physicians on Purpose podcast. Have a great rest of your day.